Hello, ladies and gentlemen. In this video, I am going to discuss Nixon versus Kennedy. Now, if, of what I'm about to talk about, um, in 1960, it was during the debates leading up to the election. Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy had a debate on television, and this was also broadcasted on radio too. Now, if you ask who won the debate, if you ask the person who won the debate, if they watched on television, an overwhelming majority said that Kennedy won. If people listened to the radio broadcast of the debate between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy, people said that Richard Nixon won. I'm not going to go by that. I'm not going to go by that. I'll tell you why. Because I think that is kind of pointless, because asking someone who won a debate, people will say who won a debate not based upon presented, but what their political leaning is. For example, if you're a Republican, and even if you watch the debate now on YouTube, you're going to say Richard Nixon won. But if you're a Democrat, you're going to say Kennedy won. So I'm not going to go by that statistics. I'm going to go by age difference. This is a new perspective, I think, that had a better appeal over Richard Nixon. If not by policy, by age. Now, a few things about Kennedy and Nixon paraded here. Born in 1913, Kennedy born in 1917. So they're part of the same generation. So by the time the 1960s come around, 1960 specifically, when the election that year is and the debate, Nixon was 47 and Kennedy was 43. Now, why does this age difference matter? I'll tell you why it matters. Nixon was the vice president to another Republican president, General Ike Eisenhower. So if you ever see the Simpsons episode where it's the election parody of 2004, and Grandpa Simpson holds up the sign, "I like Ike," it symbolizes Ike Eisenhower. Now, President Eisenhower was a World War II general in the... So, for those of you who might be watching this from overseas and don't know what the different types of the military are, I'll tell you what they are. The Navy, the Army, the Marines, National Guard, the Air Force, you name it. There's a lot of different branches of the military. 6 specifically come to mind. Now, I think I might be missing one. I don't know. But here's the thing, though. Eisenhower was the president in the 1950s, and Nixon was his vice president, as I said before. So Nixon worked with a man who was, honestly, in my opinion, one of the better Republican presidents we had in the United States. Why is this? Well, number one, Eisenhower was what you call a progressive conservative, or GOP standards, a paleo-conservative. Now, what's a progressive conservative? Well, if you know anything about Theodore Roosevelt or Teddy Roosevelt or T. Roosevelt, different names, but people just called him Teddy. If you know anything about Teddy, you would know that, number one, he started the Bull Moose Party as a third party ticket to see if he could get back the White House. Because one of his most regrets later on in life is that he gave up power too early. And he didn't want to do that. He really thought about it and said he should have kept a third term. But he didn't do that because he, being a conservative, being a Republican, he thought that going above the 2-year standard, well, 2-term standard, would be going against the Constitution, be going against American democracy and all that. And so he gave up power after his second term. He started progressive conservatism, essentially, paleoconservatism. Now, what's this exactly? It essentially is a form of conservatism where you're not really socially conservative and you're not really progressive either on a social scale. Paleoconservatism, progressive conservatism is essentially, you know that there are things that need to be changed in the country, so you change the things that need to be changed for a permanent reason, but you will not change things for transient reasons. That's essentially paleoconservatism. Keeping this in mind, when Eisenhower was in office, he Rights Bill of 1957. Now, the Civil Rights Bill of 1957 is the same bill that was passed by Lyndon B. Johnson in 1964. Now, this bill, if it would have passed through, and it had the majority of Republican support in the 1950s and the majority of Republican support in 1964, it would have given Black Americans the rights they needed to get, that they were promised after slavery was overturned in 1863. Now, since the Emancipation Proclamation, Americans 2/3 right humanship, really, which is still, in my opinion, tasteless, because you're still giving them imaginable. It did come out of it. Some of the first Black American senators, and they were all Republicans. But come to the 1950s, Eisenhower decided to start up this civil rights bill because he thought it was really important. And being a general in the army during World War II, he couldn't stand the segregation between white and Black people, because he thought that if you were fighting a common enemy, you were the same group of people. There was no difference. If you were fighting the common enemy between you and your brethren. So he was very pro civil rights. And Nixon agreed with Eisenhower on progressive conservatism. So after the bill is shot down, essentially by the Democratic Party, come 1960 and 1959, during the campaign, Richard Nixon is running this paleo-conservative strategy, which is progressive conservatism. And his policy, far better than John F. Kennedy's at the time, because he has none. He has no civil rights policy whatsoever. Richard Nixon does. He has the bare civil rights policy. And if Richard Nixon would have been elected president, and rightfully so, and I'll explain why as soon as I get explain the difference here, he would have given civil rights to Black Americans in 1961 when he would start his first term as president. Here's the thing, though. Even though Richard Nixon had the better policy and would have been a better president than Kennedy, he played dirty, and I'll get into that. America would have started to go forward with its progressive change of American society. Now, Kennedy, on the other hand, Democrat, had a different type of background than Nixon. Kennedy, a Democratic Massachusetts senator under the Eisenhower administration. So he was in Congress during the week, and he was at home at his apartment in New York City with his wife, Jackie Kennedy. And Kennedy had a racist father. Joseph P. Kennedy was a very, 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 very bigoted man. If you watched, which is a miniseries about them, Joseph P. Kennedy was a ambassador for America stationed in England, World War II. And it starts off with the speech of this, I forget the guy who played Joseph P. Kennedy, but Joseph P. Kennedy, the father, gave a speech essentially saying, don't try to denounce Hitler, don't try to stop Hitler, let Hitler do what he wants to do. That's essentially what his whole speech was gathered upon. He was a non-interventionist Democrat. He preached the same isolationist policy that FDR was preaching at the time. Now, here's the problem. When the Democrats were preaching this non-interventionist policy, this isolationist policy, what was happening? The Holocaust was happening. Millions of innocent people, just because of their religion, were being exterminated by a fascist, and by the way, who were Christians, not atheists, Christians. Gunst und in German means God is with us. Anyway, so while the Holocaust is going on and America is blatantly ignoring it, and we, in 1936, before this shit even happens, we turn away a boat of Jewish refugees. And the reasoning was, and I can't believe it was the reasoning then, the reasoning was we couldn't tell if they were really Jewish. Pathetic, right? Anyway, so with that being said, Pearl Harbor happens on December 7th, 1941, and FDR gives his famous "A Day That Will Live in Infamy" speech. And Joseph P. Kennedy, who is the ambassador in England, has Jack run for his older brother, Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., run for president in the United States. Now, here's the problem with that. Well, they were at least talking about that after they get back to America after the war. But the problem with that is, while they were in London, Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. II dies in a accident. He gets shot down by I think it was a Japanese military plane. And Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and the Kennedy family, rightfully so, is devastated. And 1950s, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. Convinces Jack to run for Senate, that one of his boys becomes president. So he runs for Senate, and that's all successful. He becomes the senator of Massachusetts, and then by that time, Eisenhower office, and by this time, he introduces the Civil Rights Bill, which the Democrats, including John F. Kennedy. Now, fast forward towards 1958, 1959, Nixon releases his presidential bid in 1958, and so does John F. Kennedy. Later on in the year, anyway. So both these men are in their 40s now. 1959, they're doing their campaigns, and they're pretty successful campaigns. Kennedy had Frank Sinatra, which gave him a little more appeal than Nixon. But the thing is, though, here's the tricky thing, though. Joseph P. Kennedy knew that Frank Sinatra knew mafia members. And Frank Sinatra, who I love, I love Frank Sinatra. I love Frank Sinatra, but Frank Sinatra knew he was being used by the Kennedys. He knew by the Kennedys. And here's the thing. Kennedy convinced Frank Sinatra needed to win Illinois and to see if Frank Sinatra could get something about it. And that's all Frank Sinatra passed upon his friend. Well, his friends, I should say. Now, Frank Sinatra was not involved with the mafia whatsoever. He was not involved with the mafia whatsoever. He knew people in the mafia because he grew up with them in New Jersey. He was from Hoboken, New Jersey, so he was a very, very poor kid. So he knew these guys that members. He knew them pretty well. They were his friends growing up. Now they were his friends as... But here's the thing, though. That's all he gave to his friends, is that Jack needs to win Illinois. That's it. He had no idea what they had in store. I sincerely know that he had no idea what they had in store. Because what happened was around, and Kennedy has an unprecedented whopping landslide against by 300 votes, which is suspicious. I'll get to that in a minute. Anyway, that's the background on Kennedy and Nixon. Now, as I said before, Nixon was 47 and Kennedy was 43. And we age based on our melanin in our skin, meaning our melanin in our skin will tell our skin at what age to start wrinkling, or when we get a jowl, loose skin, you know. So, considering that Nixon was 47 and Kennedy was 43, on television, Kennedy had much more of a youthful look than Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon kind of looked like guys look like now, like bags under them, like puffy bags under his eyes. He started to have a drooping jowl. It was slight like that, like this. It was nothing serious, but it was slight. And Nixon is known to have been a sweat box. Watch Nixon's resignation speech. He's sweating under the lights. He sweated easily. So his sweating was not due to that he was nervous. He wasn't nervous. It was just that he sweated profusely on a daily basis. He sweated buckets full. If you look at any picture with Nixon, bowling, doing press conferences, his resignation speech, and even the debate against Kennedy in 1960, so he sweated buckets full on a daily basis. So we could rule out the sweating here. But here's the thing, though. Kennedy had the more youthful look, even though he was only years younger than Nixon. Even though they were both from the same generation, both in the same age bracket, Nixon looked much older than he actually was. So therefore, the younger people were more likely to vote for Kennedy because at least Kennedy looked like someone they would want to hang out with, while Nixon looked like their father's friend. Now, older people were more likely to vote for Nixon than Kennedy because Nixon looked like a man who'd been through hell and back as a politician, and Kennedy looked like he had hardly any experience at all in politics. So the young kids were going to vote for Kennedy against Nixon because their parents would have voted for Nixon over Kennedy. The Kennedy was more of a retaliation vote to their parents' traditional ways of living, while Nixon was to keep a status quo going in society compared to possibly a new radicalized America that the parents would otherwise kind of be restricting themselves to try to understand. Now, the age difference, as I said, because if you were, put yourself in this position, you're a parent of a teenager in the 1960s. Now, you're in your late 40s, early 50s. You're in the same boat as Nixon, age-wise and appearance-wise, probably. So you understand why Nixon has the lines on his face, as the bags under his eyes. You understand that. You understand that this is a guy who's been through hell and back and has the wisdom to lead the country better than this youngster Kennedy, who is not that much younger than you, but doesn't look like he's been through hell and back. Looks like he had a pretty easy life, while Nixon looked like he struggled to get to where he was. Now, why would Nixon appeal to you if you were a parent? Well, number one, Nixon knew what it was like to struggle. Nixon did not have a wealthy background like Kennedy. So Nixon grew up in poverty, probably like you would have if you were a parent of this teenager / young adult. It's like you struggled to get where you were. You were middle class by this point, and you were near middle-aged or close to it, and you wanted to have someone in the White House who understands the wisdom it took to get there. And you want someone in the White House that your kids could look up to in order to get wisdom from. That's why if you were a parent and close to Nixon's age, or even a little bit older than Nixon, this is why you would have voted for him. Now, if you were the young adult who just turned 18, and here's why you would have gone for Kennedy. Number one, Kennedy seemed like the young, hip type of person. He was the youthful-looking politician who had an easygoing life, who had no struggle at all growing up. And he looked like he was ready to party all the time. And in fact, he did party all the time. He was a bachelor even though he was married. But here's the thing, though. Why you would have voted for Kennedy, or why you would have wanted to vote for Kennedy if you couldn't vote. Besides his youthful appearance and his understanding America's youth, he was a retaliation to your parents' way of living, because your parents would have found casual sex as your parents would have found amongst outside of your community or outside of your suburb as unheard of, because your parents would have been raised, you could have friends, but as long as you're friends within your own community, because outside of your community, there's a lot of danger there. Whatever community, but you were raised with this idea that people within your neighborhood or within your own community you were more safe around them than outside of your community. But if you were a kid of who was going to vote for Kennedy, you would have wanted to vote for Kennedy because Kennedy suggested that you meet friends internationally and outside of your neighborhood and outside your comfort zone, which, as I said, to your parents. Now, that's one of the reasons why I would have voted for Kennedy, besides the socialization and the fact that he was ready to party all the time. But here's the other reason why you would have voted for Kennedy. He had Frank Sinatra, and he had a lot of the stars of the time endorse him, even though they couldn't vote for him. You had people like the Beatles say that Kennedy would be a better choice for America. You had people that said, people like people like there were a lot of celebrity endorsements for him, but Elizabeth Taylor was for Kennedy. And Elizabeth Taylor thought that he would have been a better president for the country instead of Richard Nixon. Kennedy, the key for Kennedy's success is that he had tons of celebrity endorsements, while Richard Nixon had little to no celebrity endorsements. Now, here's the thing, though. The election was stolen from Nixon. As I said before, Kennedy had an unprecedented landslide from Nixon with 300 votes. With 300 votes. Now, Nixon's campaign called onto an investigation, and rightfully so. Well, it turns out that Frank Sinatra's friends went to Illinois and looked at the cemetery in Illinois and registered dead people to vote for Kennedy. And once this information was presented to Nixon, brought it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court told Nixon there was nothing you could do about it. And Nixon didn't try to pursue to fight it, but Nixon conceded. And Kennedy became the president in 1961. And if Kennedy would have stole the election today, Nixon would have been in office. But that's why I think Kennedy had the better appeal over Nixon, was because even though he was still in his 40s, he was younger than Nixon and looked much more youthful than Nixon did. Enjoyed the video. See you next time.